Dr. Phil has touched thousands of lives over 25 years on television. But on that day, someone walked into the studio who was from his own past. The cameras were rolling. The audience was settled in their seats. Dr. Phil was mid-sentence with a guest struggling with family estrangement when something changed in his expression. His words stopped. His eyes shifted toward the back of the stage. And then, in a voice the crew had rarely heard, he said, "Stop the tape." The studio fell silent. Producers exchanged glances. The guest looked confused. The audience held its breath. Because walking through that back entrance, moving slowly but deliberately toward the stage, was a man Dr. Phil hadn't seen in over 40 years. A man who had helped shape the person he would become long before the cameras, the fame, or the show ever existed. This is the story of that moment. And what happened next would remind everyone in that room and everyone watching at home that even Dr. Phil, the man who has guided so many through their darkest hours, still carries his own history, his own gratitude, his own unfinished chapters. It started as a typical Tuesday taping. The show's focus that day was on family reconciliation, a theme Dr. Phil had explored countless times. The guest, a woman named Rebecca, sat across from him, tears streaming down her face as she described the 15-year rift with her father. She hadn't spoken to him since her wedding day, when a heated argument had fractured what was already a fragile relationship. Dr. Phil leaned forward in his chair, his voice calm but direct. "Rebecca, let me ask you something. Do you want to be right, or do you want to have a relationship with your father?" Rebecca hesitated, her hands trembling. I want him to understand what he did to me." "I get that," Dr. Phil said. "But understanding and accountability don't always come in the order we want. Sometimes someone has to take the first step, even when it doesn't feel fair." The audience was quiet, absorbing the weight of his words. This was classic Dr. Phil, cutting through emotion to find the practical path forward. Rebecca nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with a tissue. And then something shifted. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. His gaze moved past Rebecca, past the cameras, toward the back entrance of the stage, where producers and crew members typically moved in and out during commercial breaks. But this wasn't a commercial break, and the person standing in that doorway wasn't the producer. It was an older man, probably in his mid-70s, with gray hair, wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks. He stood there, one hand resting on the doorframe, his expression a mixture of nervousness and warmth. He didn't move forward, he just waited. Dr. Phil's face transformed. The professional mask, the authority, the control, it all dissolved in an instant. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. His hand, which had been gesturing toward Rebecca, slowly lowered to his side. "Hold on," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. He looked at the crew. "Stop the tape. Stop everything." The camera operators froze. The director in the control room leaned into the microphone. "Dr. Phil, we're live to tape. Do you want to—" "I said stop," Dr. Phil repeated, standing up from his chair. He didn't look at Rebecca. He didn't look at the audience. He only looked at the man in the doorway, and then he walked toward him. The studio was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the stage lights. Rebecca sat frozen in her seat, unsure of what was happening. The audience leaned forward, trying to understand. Even the crew members who had seen Dr. Phil handle thousands of unpredictable moments had never seen him like this. Dr. Phil reached the man and stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other. Two men separated by decades, but connected by something the audience couldn't yet understand. "Joe," Dr. Phil finally said, his voice breaking slightly on the name. The man, Joe, nodded. "Hello, Phil." And then Dr. Phil did something almost no one had ever seen him do on his own show. He stepped forward and pulled Joe into an embrace. Not a polite hug, not a professional gesture. A real, honest, tight embrace between two people who had once mattered deeply to each other. The audience began to murmur. Some wiped their eyes. Others whispered to the person next to them. But no one knew the full story yet. No one understood why this moment had just brought Dr. Phil McGraw, one of the most composed figures on television, to the edge of tears. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. When Dr. Phil finally stepped back, he kept one hand on Joe's shoulder, as if afraid he might disappear if he let go. He turned to the audience, his eyes slightly red, and said, "I need to explain something." He gestured for Joe to sit in the guest chair next to Rebecca, who had now realized this wasn't about her anymore. She moved to a seat off to the side, giving the two men space. Dr. Phil sat back down, but his posture was different. He wasn't the host anymore. He was just a man with a memory he needed to share. "This," he said, pointing to Joe, "is Joe Denton, and I haven't seen him in 42 years. The audience was riveted. Dr. Phil took a breath, composing himself. "When I was 19 years old, I was lost. I was angry, directionless, and honestly, I was heading down a really bad path. I dropped out of college. I was working odd jobs, getting into fights, making terrible decisions, and I had convinced myself that I didn't need anyone's help." He looked at Joe, who was listening quietly, his hands folded in his lap. "Joe was my high school football coach," Dr. Phil continued. "But more than that, he was the first person who didn't give up on me when I had already given up on myself." Joe smiled softly, but said nothing. "I showed up at his house one night," Dr. Phil said, his voice steadier now. "I was 19, drunk, angry at the world. I don't even remember why I went there, but I knocked on his door at 11 at night, and he didn't turn me away. He let me in, he made me coffee, and he sat with me for 4 hours while I talked about everything that was eating me alive." Dr. Phil paused, looking down at his hands. "At the end of that night, Joe said to me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Phil, you're not broken, you're just stuck. And the difference between being stuck and being lost is that stuck people can still move forward. They just need to decide to do it.'" The audience was silent, hanging on every word. "I left his house that night and I made a decision," Dr. Phil said. "I went back to school, I got my life together. I stopped blaming the world and started taking responsibility. And every step I took after that night, I took because Joe believed I could." He looked back at Joe, who was now visibly emotional. "But here's the part I'm not proud of," Dr. Phil said. "I never went back to thank him. I got busy. Life moved fast. I built a career, started a family, and somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that he probably didn't even remember that night, that it wasn't as big a deal to him as it was to me." Joe finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Phil, I remembered." Dr. Phil nodded, his jaw tight. "I know you did, and I should have come back sooner." Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He stood up, walked off the stage, and returned a moment later holding something small in his hand. It was a worn, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "I found this 2 weeks ago," Dr. Phil said, holding it up. "I was going through old boxes in my garage, and I came across something I'd written the morning after that night at Joe's house." He unfolded the paper carefully and read aloud. "Thank you, Coach Denton. I don't know if I'll ever be someone important, but if I am, I'll make sure people know it started with you." His voice cracked on the last few words. He looked at Joe. "I wrote that 42 years ago, and I never gave it to you." Joe's eyes filled with tears. The audience was openly crying now, many of them standing without realizing it. Dr. Phil handed Joe the paper. "I'm giving it to you now, 42 years too late. but I'm giving it to you." Joe took the paper with both hands, looking down at the handwriting of a 19-year-old kid who would one day become the man sitting across from him. He folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "You don't owe me anything, Phil," Joe said. "You never did. I saw something in you that you couldn't see in yourself yet. That's what coaches do. That's what people who care do." Dr. Phil wiped his eyes quickly, trying to regain composure, but it was clear this moment had cracked something open in him. "The reason I'm sharing this," Dr. Phil said, turning back to the audience, "is because I want you to understand something. We all have people in our lives who changed us, people who showed up when they didn't have to, people who believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves, and we owe it to them and to ourselves to let them know." He looked at Rebecca, who was still sitting off to the side, tears streaming down her face. "Rebecca, you came here today to talk about your father, about the hurt and the distance. But what Joe just reminded me is that time doesn't wait. Gratitude doesn't wait. And if we wait too long, we lose the chance to say what needs to be said." Rebecca nodded, her hand covering her mouth. "I'm not telling you to forgive your father today," Dr. Phil said gently. "I'm not telling you to forget what happened, but I am telling you that life is short, and the people who shaped us, for better or worse, deserve to know how we turned out." He looked back at Joe. "Joe, you changed my life, and I never told you. But I'm telling you now, in front of all these people, so there's no more waiting. Thank you for seeing me, for not giving up, for being the kind of man I try to be every day on this stage." Joe stood up slowly, his legs a little unsteady, and Dr. Phil stood with him. They embraced again, this time longer, and the audience erupted into applause. Not polite, scripted applause, real, raw, emotional applause that filled the entire studio. But what happened next is something no one in the room or watching at home saw coming. As the applause continued, Dr. Phil turned to his producers off camera and said, "Cancel the rest of the show. Reschedule everything. I'm not doing anything else today." The head producer, visible now on the edge